In the world of fantasy literature, we often run into many familiar faces: elves, pixies, orcs, gnomes, what have you. Though these creatures in modern media can feel tropey and sometimes archetypal, just about every modern fantasy creature owes its identity or is at least highly influenced by older folk monsters and folk creatures. Some of these creatures becoming very different in their modern incarnations, or returning to form in some sort of way after a long time of being changed. The first major fantasy family is the European one, and the greatest ancestor of almost every single European fantasy creature is the elf, or as the Old Norse called them, the Alfar. These creatures, though close to the archetypal modern fantasy elf, are a lot more strange, being described as strange, ethereal people with pointed ears. They could do anything from be great forge masters to strange seductresses dancing in the mist. And this lack of any concrete role is what made them easier to conflate and confuse with other creatures within similar folklores. One of the first conflations with elves was a conflation with dwarves, as many elves could be forge master elves, and so could dwarves. And dwarves, being more short and stocky and stout in nature, began to skew the elven silhouette from being this tall sort of thing to being a tall sort of thing or a short sort of thing. Eventually, as myth and story carried on over time within these people groups, the word elf began to change meaning. Instead of just your elves and dwarves being conflated, it became a sort of catch-all term for the weird little critters that would run around when you weren't looking. Nixies, strange river spirits, were often conflated with the term elf, as well as pixies and gnomes and brownies and many more. The modern-day Christmas elf owes its heritage to this elf rebranding. The term elf itself began to fall out of favor in use because there were more specific names for the more specific creatures at the time, and also because Christianity was taking hold and having a whole bunch of pagan folk characters was not really an idea the church liked all that. But it's not exactly like Christianity had no influence. In fact, on the contrary, Christianity kick-started a renaissance within the depiction of elves as they used to be depicted. Through misinterpretation and probably appreciation of Christian manuscripts about angels, elves began to retain, in Iceland at the very least, an older form. Elves became something more akin to the ethereal, pointed-eared, beautiful people. In fact, most elves would be acquainted with a sort of nymph idea of pretty women who would seduce. And on the flip side of this coin, many of these creatures began to be quite literally demonized, with the term Orcus springing up as a callback to an old god of the underworld in Greece, also known as Orcus. These Orcus creatures would have been mischievous and or evil sprites of some sort that would have fallen under the elf moniker years and years ago. This is where we get the term orc. Sometime after the Christianization of Europe, where these folk creatures began to change based on the ruling religions and folk traditions of the time, elves had a resurgence. Well, not exactly elves. Fairies had a large resurgence, thanks to none other than William Shakespeare, whose Midsummer Night's Dream revolutionized elves in the popular cultures of the time. In fact, translations of A Midsummer Night's Dream were so popular in Germany that elves began to have a renaissance within the entirety of continental Europe, Germany especially, with elves, pucks, pixies, and fairies making their way into many of the Romantic era paintings of the time. Elf yet again in Europe became a widely used term, even if the meaning had changed somewhat from its original incarnation. The elves depicted in this time would have little butterfly wings, sometimes would be little strange gray-skinned green men, dwarves, or any other manner of small person that the term elf had been conflated with by this time. But this begs the question: if these elves and orcs and goblins and what have you are so different from their modern counterparts today, where did that transition come from? Well, It comes from none other than the esteemed author J.R.R. Tolkien and his own world of Middle-earth. Tolkien is largely, if not entirely, responsible for the modern conception of the fantasy elf, the fantasy goblin, the fantasy orc, and the fantasy dwarf, as he was trying to reinvent an old European mythology to tell stories within. One of these things preserved most commonly is his idea of an elf. The so-called Tolkien elf is an ethereal, perfect being that can do no wrong because they are one of the gods' favorites. Now, this has sort of created an elven exceptionalism thing and brought them back closer to their old ethereal counterparts. The dwarves of this world are less so creatures that hold up the world and create everything, and more so hermit men that live beneath mountains, mining to satisfy their greed, oftentimes dueling and fighting with the destructive, conniving goblins, also called orcs in the language that Tolkien wrote for the elves. These orcs are closer to your small, strange pixie men, but with a lot more lethality and edge. These orcs, who served in Sauron's army in the books, also served alongside a corrupted, bastardized version of elves called Uruk-hai by their leader Saruman. Now, in popular culture, the orc and the Uruk-hai have sort of merged into the idea of the green-skinned scary orc, which has other influences as well that we will get into later. But the idea of goblin has also remained, leaving two things that share a sort of name historically being completely different. One being a tiny, scheming, conniving, sniveling, green-skinned creature, and another one being an 8-foot-tall hulk of mass destruction green-skinned creature. Some properties handle this strange deviation by making orcs and goblins just part of the same sort of family, like Warhammer does, and others just sort of leave it as a funny coincidence, or maybe they're created by the same dark power, as they are in The Lord of the Rings. The cultural influences for many of the peoples within Tolkien's Middle-earth have also influenced the modern depictions of the different races within fantasy. Elves are often depicted as people who live in deep magical forests, engaging in the finer things, such as research of magic or just conservation of the world around them. They're seen as sort of perfect beings who can oftentimes have a superiority complex or just seem rather snobby to everybody else. The halfling is based off of, well, Middle England, as, fat farmers who sit and eat a lot and smoke a lot, which Tolkien would no doubt have been familiar with. This has sort of influenced many of the squatter races' sort of jolliness about them, including dwarves. Dwarves are based on probably Scotsmen, as I am sort of led to believe by the source material, as they are rather boastful and loud and proud of, their heritage as dwarves, which, if you talk to a Scotsman, you'll notice very quickly where that attitude comes from. Orcs are very interesting, as it's not very clear as to what they were made to represent. Tolkien probably didn't write them with any sort of representation in mind, instead writing them as a sort of force of nature to be wielded by Sauron as a sort of hammer to crush good with. If there was any influence that I could discern, it may have been the German war machine, as Tolkien was a World War I veteran, and the way that the orcs are, and by extension Uruk-hai, are talked about as a sort of mass-produced army that marches in great columns to go take places that don't belong to them, which a First World War veteran would probably have those views based on, first-hand experience. Another large influence on modern fantasy races comes from Asia, specifically Japan. Japan's folklore played no small part in the change of fantasy creatures over time. Violent, colorful raiding creatures known as oni definitely influenced orcs, especially in their color palette, as many orcs in popular culture are green, one of the cardinal colors of an oni. In addition, their vaguely menacing, wide-jawed, big-toothed appearance has definitely influenced orcs in many different pieces of media, as most orcs in the modern day are depicted with big tusks coming from an underbite, and massive, wide silhouettes with huge jaws. Interestingly enough, the Japanese conception of an orc almost has nothing to do with their own conceptions of Oni, seeing as those ideas are still popular within their folk traditions and their culture. The Japanese conception of an orc is a weird pig creature, which became popular in no short part because of Dungeons & Dragons and their influence on Japanese fantasy as a whole. One thing that came from Japan and stayed popular in Japan as well as the rest of the world is the elementalizing of elves. The terms wood elf and high elf used to just be, within fantasy, descriptors of where the elves lived. However, as time went on, the elves began to become elementalized, with wood elves becoming more bestial than their high elf counterparts, who themselves were split sometimes between sun elves and moon elves, or high elves and dark elves, with the darker moon elves being seen as rather, if not evil outright, edgier or more morose, with blood elves later being added to the roster of common elf types due to its popularity in the game World of Warcraft that became a global success after its release. And through all these changes, the modern idea of an elf shifted from a sort of strange magical creature with ethereal power that is perfect and more into a smarmy, snide, magical elitist. And while this stereotype remains in fantasy literature today, some stories treat elves as heroes of myth, chief among them being the Japanese-created Legend of Zelda series, where these elves shed the name elf and become known as Hylians, which are pointed-eared, fair-skinned, and when they're not dwelling in castles and cities, dwell in forests instead. Japan, and by extension some of the other Far Eastern countries, have had much more influence in fantasy than on just the races alone. In fact, elementals as a whole are almost certainly influenced by local ideas of elemental personification. That paired with a number of frightening monsters of myth being wholesale lifted from the region into many of these fantasy worlds, along with increasing amounts of Eastern culture entering through in cultural depictions of these fantasy races. With the scope of all of fantasy, of course, there are things you can miss, like ogres and giants and that sort of thing. But I think that the archetypal fantasy lineage of the elf, the gnome, the orc, and the dwarf is a very good point for starting off on research into many of these sort of cousin creatures. And with that, I hope it got you interested, and I hope you enjoyed my analysis of the different cultures and different ways that they influenced and started depicting in modern fantasy. Thank you so much for your time.